Hello and welcome back to the APUSH History Curriculum for Era 8. In this video, we will be looking at Topic 8.9, The Great Society, which is a look at Lyndon Johnson's domestic programs. So let's get to it. Although the post-war years had some uncertainty because of the Cold War, they were also a time of peace and prosperity. Many Americans became more financially secure in the 1950s and ascended into the middle class. Young men and women married in record numbers and purchased homes where they could start families of their own. The rate of home ownership grew from 43.6% in 1940 to almost 62% in 1960. Many of these newly purchased homes had been built in the new suburban areas that had begun to radiate out from American cities after the war. The development of the suburbs also increased reliance on the automobile for transportation. Suburban men drove to work in nearby cities or, when possible, were driven to commuter rail stations by their wives. In the early years of suburban development, before schools, parks, and supermarkets were built, access to an automobile was crucial, and the pressure on families to purchase a second one was strong. As families rushed to purchase them, the annual production of passenger cars leaped from 2.2 million to 8 million between 1946 and 1955, and by 1960, about 20% of suburban families owned 2 cars. Even most blue-collar families could afford such elements of a middle-class lifestyle as new cars, homes, and even regular vacations. Most African Americans, however, were not members of the middle class. The difference in median income between white and black families was almost double, although black families had a more than 40% increase in income between 1950 and 1960. This often kept them from moving into suburbs, if suburban housing options were even available, since banks often refused to loan money and some housing developments refused to sell to black homebuyers. The white flight to the suburbs left behind an impoverished urban environment with less investment in infrastructure, less employment, and less educational opportunities. Oftentimes, old urban neighborhoods were torn down for highways and new business areas to benefit urban commuters, displacing those who had been there before the redevelopment and who would not be welcome to return. More than 22% of the overall population lived in poverty in 1960, a percentage that represented more than 35 million people. The definition of poverty was an income of less than $3,100 a year for a family of 4. The median family income was $5,600. This poverty was particularly prevalent in rural areas, the inner city, and amongst minority groups, a situation brought to the attention of the American public with the publication of Michael Harrington's book, The Other America. His work is similar to the Progressive Era publication, How the Other Half Lives, by Jacob Riis. This book made the case that poverty was a systemic problem that could trap people in a downward spiral, and criticized the U.S. government's response to the problem, and directly inspired LBJ. Liberalism reflects the belief that the government has the power to address and solve societal problems, especially those too large or too deeply rooted in complex systems for individuals or private entities to handle. This idea had emerged during the New Deal era when President Franklin Delano Roosevelt used the federal government to combat the effects of the Great Depression. Now, Lyndon Johnson would also embrace this form of liberalism to address ongoing poverty in America, declaring a war on poverty. He was influenced by his own poor upbringing, as well as his time as a teacher in Texas, where he witnessed firsthand how childhood poverty limited the opportunities for those he taught. Johnson's vision of liberalism also extended beyond poverty. It aimed to combat inequality and discrimination while also promoting anti-communism abroad. This anti-communist stance led Johnson to escalate U.S. involvement in Vietnam, hoping to prevent the spread of communist influence, which we looked at in the last video. Domestically, Johnson's policies resonated with the American public, leading to his landslide victory over Barry Goldwater in the 1964 election. However, Goldwater's brand of conservatism, advocating for a smaller government, planted the seeds for a future conservative movement that would eventually propel Ronald Reagan to the presidency in 1980. These liberal ideas were expressed in Johnson's Great Society programs, which addressed discrimination, poverty, and other social issues. We'll take a closer look at the civil rights legislation in the next topic, but the two key laws you should connect to this Great Society are the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination and ended segregation in public places, as well as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which eliminated certain barriers to voting, like literacy tests, and provided for federal oversight of elections if needed. To combat poverty, Congress passed the Economic Opportunity Act that was designed to help disadvantaged Americans improve their lives. The act included Head Start programs to prepare children from disadvantaged areas for school, Job Corps providing employment for disadvantaged young people in the inner cities, adult basic education programs, work-study programs for people attending colleges and university, and VISTA, a domestic version of the Peace Corps. Congress also enacted Medicare, a hospital insurance program for the elderly and those with disability, and Medicaid, a similar program for the unemployed and those with low incomes. The Child Nutrition Act and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act were also part of it and were built on the belief that increasing funding to schools serving disadvantaged students would improve outcomes and opportunities for these children. But President Johnson's Great Society programs didn't stop at education. They tackled a wide range of social issues as well, including infrastructure and housing. Johnson established both the Department of Transportation and the Department of Housing and Urban Development, recognizing that housing was a key factor in perpetuating socioeconomic and racial inequalities. By helping secure housing for marginalized groups, the government sought to reduce these disparities. In addition, Johnson's policies addressed public safety and environmental protection. The National Traffic and Motor Vehicle Safety Act created a regulatory agency to oversee the auto industry, spurred by Ralph Nader's expose of safety issues. Meanwhile, environmental concern gained traction after Rachel Carson's groundbreaking work highlighted the dangers of synthetic pesticides like DDT, ultimately leading to its ban. The Great Society programs were extensive and significantly expanded the size and role of the federal government, much like FDR's New Deal had done decades earlier. Johnson's vision aimed to create a more just and equitable society, leaving a lasting impact on the nation. Finally, the issue of immigration reform became part of the Great Society. The Immigration Act of 1965 dramatically reshaped U.S. immigration policy by replacing the National Origins Act of 1924, which had severely limited immigration from the Eastern Hemisphere by imposing a quota that capped entries at just 2% of each nationality's 1890 population. It also replaced the 1917 Immigration Act, which not only mandated a literacy test, but also created a barred zone that excluded most of Asia from immigrating to the U.S. These restrictive laws had a profound impact. Within 40 years, they had reduced the percentage of foreign-born residents in the U.S. from over 20% to just over 5%. However, the Western Hemisphere had never been subject to these same limitations. The 1965 Act removed these restrictions, replacing them with a uniform system that applied to all countries. Now every nation, including those in the Western Hemisphere, was subject to a yearly cap of 20,000 immigrants, with an overall annual limit of 290,000 migrants. Family reunification was the exception. U.S. citizens could sponsor relatives from abroad, and these family members were not counted against either the per-country or total caps. This policy shift had two major consequences. First, it led to a surge in immigration, with the percentage of foreign-born residents rising again to over 15% in the following 40 years. Economically, these new immigrants joined the workforce, pushing the percentage of foreign-born laborers nearly back to pre-quota levels. The second unintended consequence was the creation of a new challenge: illegal immigration. Since Western Hemisphere countries, particularly Mexico and Central America, had not previously been subject to caps, a pattern of seasonal migration had emerged. Migrant workers, often called birds of passage, would travel to the U.S. to work for several months before returning home with their earnings. However, after the 1965 acts imposed strict caps on immigration from the Western Hemisphere, this system was disrupted. With increased restrictions and uncertainty about whether they could return to the U.S., many of these migrants opted to stay rather than risk being denied re-entry. As the immigration quotas filled quickly, more migrants from Latin America began avoiding official entry points altogether to avoid being turned away, giving rise to a wave of unauthorized immigration. Well, that about covers what you need to know about topic 8.9, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. Be sure to keep up with your reading, and I'll catch you in the next video.